Chapter 4 39 Days After. Graduation happened about a month later, the Friday of Memorial Day weekend, and ours was the kind of school where all the kids attended, even if it wasn't your year to walk. My mom and I met Beckett's family at the ceremony in the football stadium, and afterward, Beck and I milled around watching while the parents talked and the graduates set off firecrackers. It was a cloudless day, warm and dry, and I sported a strappy green dress Maddie let me borrow. I stood with Beckett, but I watched Andrew Parker and his cousin Ryan talking with a group of senior girls from the soccer team. They were shouting and roughhousing, trying to impress the girls, I figured. Next to me, Beckett said, "You're gaping." And I said, "I'm not." And he said, "Well, you shouldn't be. He's a spoiled jackass, Kelly. Move on." Andrew and I had ended up in the same elective that semester, art history. And the week before, after our final exam, he'd stopped me on the way out of class. "Think you did okay?" he asked, and I nodded. A group of kids moved past us and into the crowded hallway, but I just stood there, cement footed, so ridiculously awkward as he lingered by the door and shifted the straps on his backpack. "I'm sorry about your dad," he said. "I always liked him." Dad and Andrew had this friendly kind of banter thing they did when Andrew hung out around the house. The whole thing with Andrew didn't last long, 4.5 months. But when we'd been whatever it was that we were, Andrew came by our place a lot, and he and my dad hit it off pretty well. "You still playing in that band?" Andrew asked, and I said, "Yeah." The first bell rang, but we just stood there. "I heard you guys are playing Julie Hess's party after graduation," he said, but I shook my head. "Not us." Julie Hess floated rumors about asking us to play, but in the end, she'd gotten her cousin from Seattle to come down for her party. He played in some lame boy band that called themselves Browbeater. "That's too bad. I was hoping to get to see you play," he said, which surprised me since he'd never shown much interest in my drumming back when we were dating. Then the second bell rang, and he reached out and did this weird thing. He took my hand, lifted it, pressed his palm against mine, and then laced our fingers together. I looked at our hands, his with that dumb copper ring he always wore, and mine with the thin leather bracelet I'd bought from a hippie kid in Golden Gate Park. Then he pulled me toward him. Before Andrew Parker, my friends would have described me as determined and focused, cautious maybe. But then Andrew, for some reason I never figured out, started paying attention to me, offering me rides home from school and showing up at my track meets. And when we were together, I caught myself acting like someone else, someone carefree and courageous. He took me to restaurants and I ate food I'd never tried before, like real sushi with those little orange fish egg things on top. We went jet skiing in Sausalito, even though I'd been afraid of those kinds of adventure sports. He talked me into sneaking out in the middle of the night to meet him at the park, and he even convinced me to skip track practice a handful of times and hang out with him and his friends in the marina. And then he asked if he could be my first. I'd seen the films and read the books, knew nothing would be the same after we did it. But that's what part of me wanted, for everything to change, for something big and monumental to finally happen to me. I thought on it for a long time and eventually decided I was ready, or ready enough, and that he was the right person because he was different. He was better than any of the other boys I'd dated, and he made me feel important, made me feel fearless. So I told him I would, and we did that awkward but exciting thing when you start imagining how it's going to go, when you start planning it and letting yourself picture the lighting in the room, the music in the background, and all that skin on skin. But before I had the chance to go through with it, Lisa Stone from the track team caught him making out with some girl in a cafe in the Mission. The whole thing was ridiculously lame and straight out of an after school special. The argument, the denial, the claiming she was just a friend of the family, a girl he'd met on vacation who was in town visiting the city. It was totally cliche. After all that worrying, after the pros and cons I'd cataloged in my head, and the eventual decision to give him this important part of me that I could only give away once, after all that planning and imagining us being together in that way, I realized I'd never actually known him at all. It was embarrassing, mortifying, really. So I broke up with him before he could break up with me, right before winter break. He told his friends it was the other way around, and I didn't bother to correct him, not even to Beckett. Because the truth was, it wasn't Andrew Parker that broke my heart. It was the lie. This huge scam about love and trust and the possibility of being connected, really connected to another person in that more than just friends way. Which got me thinking that maybe lots of things we'd been told for so long were just cons too. Andrew dropped my hand from his. I'm sorry, he said before he turned his eyes to the ground. I'm just really sorry, Cal. Maybe about my dad, or maybe about the rest of it too. I couldn't be sure which. But for some reason, some ridiculous reason, I almost started crying. Right there in the art history room with the rest of the school scattering to their next classes. So I tucked my hands into my pockets, stared at the floor too, and just shrugged. See you around, I guess, he said. And I said, see ya. And that was it. I watched as Ryan and Andrew and the girls from the soccer team drifted into the crowd, moving between bodies in graduation gowns and parents taking photos. He's not a jackass, I said to Beckett. He's just a normal boy, I guess. That's all. Whatever, he said. So we need to talk. I've made plans for tonight. Every year since sixth grade, Beckett and I spent the evening of the last day of high school in Alta Plaza, a small park at the top of the hill in my neighborhood. At first, we'd just hang around talking about our summer plans and how glad we were that school was over. Then, after freshman year, we started bringing artifacts from the previous school year, like things that reminded us of experiences we were glad were over, like our trig final and the script for the high school musical our parents talked us into trying out for, or the photo of me sporting that bad haircut with the bangs sophomore year. We'd sift through them, swapping embarrassing memories, and then we'd bury them somewhere in the park. The year before, Beckett invited Alan Nelson, the boy he crushed on that spring, and we hung around playing cards and trading stories until eventually Alan and Beck wandered off on their own, and Beckett finally, after all that time, kissed a boy. But afterward, Alan turned awkward and started arguing with Beck over nothing, and I ended up feeling like the worst kind of third wheel. After that, we vowed never to bring along people we wanted to make out with. So I figured that was our plan, Alta Plaza Park, just me and Beckett and a shoebox full of memorabilia I was ready to put behind me. Obviously, we're not going to Julie Hess's party, he said. Obviously. Screw Julie Hess's party, right? You got it. But I'm switching it up this year, he said. Big Basin Redwoods. We're going camping tonight. Nearby, our mother stood with Beckett's dad, who was talking on his cell phone. Beckett's dad did something with money and numbers and banks in one of the tall buildings downtown, something we didn't really understand, but seemed to require that he used his cell phone often and in public. They didn't know I was watching, but Lori reached over and put her hand on my mom's arm, who looked more tired and thinner than usual. She said something, and Lori said something back, and my mom looked at the ground. Even from where I was standing, I could tell she was close to tears, and I worried that Lori might not be any better than I was at knowing what to say to make my mom feel less miserable. Our moms already talked it over and said it was okay, Beckett told me, because we're like 4-year-olds and all. My mom caught me watching her and then waved with this slow, faint flick of her wrist, a half wave. And even with all that sadness, she still looked beautiful. And I invited Thing One and Thing Two, Beckett said, motioning to Madison and Rabbit, who were nearby, but not paying attention to us because they were too busy flirting. Maddie had one hand on her hip and the other hand hooked through Rabbit's belt loop, and he was nodding like whatever she said was the most important thing he'd ever heard. The bigger one's driving, Beckett said, because Rabbit was the only one of us who had a car. Big Basin was south of San Francisco and about half an hour outside Santa Cruz. And when Nicole Wolf got pregnant our sophomore year, everybody said that's where it happened. That's the only thing I knew about the campground since I had never been there. There'll be marshmallows and hot chocolate, Beckett said. I don't do ghost stories, I told him. Point taken. I looked at our mothers again, and a wave of nausea rolled over me as Lori dug through her purse, fished out a tissue, and handed it to my mom, whose shoulders were shaking like branches in a storm. Beckett caught me watching them. It'll be good, he said, to blow off some steam. You could use a night away, I bet. I guess. Trust me, he said. I promise this is the perfect way to end the school year. We planned to leave the city around 3, which gave me plenty of time for lunch with Beckett and my mom and Lori at our favorite cafe downtown. Gigantic spinach salads with grilled salmon, bowls of tomato soup, since it was usually cool enough in San Francisco in the summertime to eat soup, warm bread, and whipped sage butter. On the drive home from lunch, my mom scanned the radio stations, dodging reports on the war in Iraq and an NPR discussion about the effects iTunes was having on brick and mortar chains like Tower Records. Eventually, she just turned it off, and I stared out the window. I doubt that she'd meant to, but somehow we ended up driving right by the job site. There it was, the last place my dad had ever been seen. But it was different. A row of porta-johns hugged the fence on one side, and all the leftover parts of the original building were gone except for the old brick chimney, which had been built into the shell of the new condo high-rise they were constructing. There was a huge crane lifting and moving steel beams, and one of those spinning trucks mixing concrete, and the place was crowded with guys in hard hats and safety vests. I rolled down my window and asked Mom to slow down. How'd they do all that already? I mumbled, and then it hit me. It had been over a month since Beck and I went to the site, 39 days since my dad went missing, and all I'd done was hang some lame flyers. What had I been doing all that time? Back at our house, I changed clothes and packed for the night, even though I was in a rotten mood and didn't feel like going camping anymore. I slammed drawers shut, kicked open my closet door, and threw my backpack on the floor when I was finished filling it. Are you okay? Mom asked from the doorway. I didn't realize she'd been there watching. Not really. Are you? I asked, angry that she'd let me get away with it, that she'd let me wallow and sit around doing nothing. Angry, too, that she hadn't tried harder to find him either. 39 days and no leads. It was ridiculous. Sure, I guess, she said, and she brought her fingers to her mouth and started chewing, which made me feel bad for snapping at her like that. Then I remembered that just like Beckett and me, she and my dad had their own rituals on the last night of school, an early dinner at Annie's Bistro, a small restaurant in our neighborhood. They'd walk down Fillmore afterward to look at books at browsers and buy a bottle of wine from the market. They'd be on the couch, sleeping usually, by the time I'd come in from the park, their legs intertwined under the blanket because our TV room was always just a little bit cold. It'll be okay, she said, the words repeated over and over again the past month while we sat around like zombies going through the motions. It crossed my mind that if she didn't know how to make things right, and if I didn't either, there was a good chance the world might never feel normal again. It was that thought that scared me the most. I thought I'd get a head start cleaning the house tonight. That sounds so depressing, I told her, and I sank to my bed. You're right. It does, doesn't it? She said with a half smile. It sounds miserable. She sat down next to me. The university gave her the week off after Memorial Day every year, and she used that time for spring cleaning and to catch up on her reading before she began her summer work, sitting at the circulation desk. Eventually, I said, I'm sorry to be leaving you alone. I know you and Dad usually, but I couldn't finish the sentence as the words got stuck in my throat. It'll be okay, she said. Give me a call if you get the chance. Beck's bringing his phone? She asked, and I nodded. He was the only one out of our friends who had his own cell, so he got stuck sharing it on trips like that. I don't have to go, I told her. I could stay home. We could make dinner or order in. Right, because hanging out with your mom would be a wonderful way to celebrate the end of the school year. She nudged her shoulder against my shoulder. I wouldn't mind, I told her. I know you wouldn't, but we both know Beck would have a fit, she said, which was true. It's okay, really. I'm fine, baby, she said. Now get out of here. Be safe and be home in time for dinner tomorrow. Rabbit drove his old Volvo wagon, and we coasted south, with Maddie riding shotgun and me and Beckett in the back. Girls in the back, Rabbit said to Beck, because sometimes he acted like a moron, but we knew it was just for show. Beckett rolled his eyes. Words wound, he said, but as a veteran of 12 years in the United States Senate, I happily attest that words do not kill. You're a loser, Rabbit, he said, and then to me, Lyndon Johnson. We drove through San Mateo, Redwood City, and Palo Alto, moving down Highway 101 through the weekend traffic. Eventually, we stopped in Saratoga to fill up on gas and get last chance rations. I bought pistachios, Beckett got dental floss, Rabbit said he didn't need a thing, and Madison got a jug of water, a bundle of firewood, and a pack of batteries. The closer we got to the mountains, the better the air smelled, heaty like redwoods and spicy like those Asian restaurants in the inner Richmond district. I'm glad we're doing this, I told them when we got back in the car. I know, Beckett said. And there's more, too. Tomorrow we're taking you to the MoMA. There's a history exhibit going up, and I figured it would be fun if we went. All of us, he announced. We stopped at the park entrance for maps and to pay the cost of camping for the night. We checked out our assigned spot and took some photos of the redwoods while the light was still good. And then we set up our tents and gathered sticks to start a fire. Becca and Lori had always liked to camp. It was kind of their mother-son thing. So he had all the good equipment, like an easy cooker camp griddle, lots of those canvas folding chairs with the cup holders, and a tent that was big enough for the both of us. Maddie was in charge of the food, and Rabbit brought the fun stuff, like a deck of cards, travel Yahtzee, and bocce balls. We began getting things ready for dinner just as the sun was setting. Grilled cheese sandwiches with tomatoes, garlic salt, and sliced avocados. I snacked on pistachios and helped prep the food while Rabbit played a new song he'd been working on. Next to me, Maddie heated up the stove, a large portable griddle built into a wood frame and hooked onto a tank of propane. At the next side over, someone slammed a trunk shut while someone else started laughing. The sky was turning that pastel colored palette that made you feel grateful but a little bit sad too. Dusk has always been my favorite time of day. You do this a lot, huh, Beck? Maddie asked, and Beckett nodded from his crouching position by the fire pit as he arranged the wood and tucked the newspaper under the teepee of sticks he'd built. We go at least a few times a year, he said, me and my mom, my numero uno. As an only child, Beckett and his mom were closer than him and his dad for a million different reasons. His dad worked downtown while Lori's jewelry studio was set up in their garage, making her a kind of stay-at-home mom, so she spent more time with Beck. He liked art and creative things just like Lori did, while his dad liked numbers, which Beckett was always terrible at. The list went on, but I also always wondered if he wouldn't have been as open about liking his mom best if his dad had been a little nicer when Beckett first came out. I was an only child too, but it was because my parents couldn't afford to stay in the city if they had more than one kid, and they always said there was nowhere else in the world they wanted to live. And when I thought about it, I realized that if someone had forced me to pick between the two, I would have said I had been always closer with my dad, that I liked him better, even, for no good reason that came to mind. There'd been something between us that was different than the relationship between my mom and me. I loved them both, of course, and it was kind of screwed up to even think about it that way. But if I had said my numero uno, it would have been my dad that I meant. The grilled cheese sandwiches were perfect, and we played gin rummy until it was too dark to see the cards, and then we played music on the guitars Rabbit and Maddie brought. Cover songs Beck could sing with, and new ones we'd been working on at practice. And as it got later, we started making them up on the spot, dumb stuff that didn't make sense but still kind of sounded good. And then Beckett pulled out a half full bottle of whiskey he must have lifted from his parents and said, "When the president does it, that means it's not illegal." A pause. "Richard Nixon," he said. "But it sure worked for Clinton, too." "I bet it was the Nixon interview with David Frost," I said, and Beckett said, "Nerd," and smiled. Even in the dark, I could see his dimples like commas, one in each cheek. That's how he got away with most stuff. "With Clinton, it was pot, Rabbit said. "Please tell me you didn't bring weed, Beck." Beck shook his head no. "I'm not a total hoodlum," he said. "Well, not yet, at least." The dimples again. "I'm not going to give you the 'this is your brain on drugs' talk," my dad said once, using his fingers to mime the quote marks. I was 14, and our middle school principal had mailed a letter to every student's family after a bunch of kids got caught getting stoned in the restroom at school. But I will say that I think you're a smart kid, and that's a good thing, being smart. It's also not a given. Staying smart, he said. That is, he told me. You have to make good decisions to make sure that you stay smart. Brain cells and all that. I nodded, embarrassed to be talking about drugs, but trying to bear it. But if you're going to do it, if you're going to try it, just don't be stupid, he said. Make sure you're somewhere safe and don't do too much of it. Don't do it too often, he said. Not often at all, actually, if ever. As in, hardly ever if you try it, and only when you're safe. I knew he was doing his best, but it was super awkward, and I just wanted the conversation to end ASAP. And always, always, always give me a call if you think it's gotten out of control, he said. And then he left it at that. The fire was going strong as we sat in a circle, leaning toward the light. It suddenly felt late, but we kept at it, roasting marshmallows and taking turns stoking the flames. Rabbit had Maddie's feet in his lap, one hand on her legs and one hand spinning the gravity pull. By the time Beckett opened the whiskey again, he was talking about Fellini. He told us Fellini had failed his military exam. Fellini had enrolled in law school but never attended a class. In the end, Fellini only had a high school degree. Who does that? He said. Who goes to law school and doesn't show up? He took a swig from the bottle and tried to pass it over to Maddie, who shook her head no. He skipped Rabbit and handed it to me, but I put it down on my feet. I'd do it, I said. Do what? I mean, not the law school part. Law school is impossible to get into, but the school thing in general. Beckett said, What are you talking about, Callie? And next to him, Maddie shifted in her camping chair. Beckett and I had made a plan about the school thing back when we were freshmen, and he'd visited his cousin in Portland for the first time. He would go to the Art Institute, and I would go to Portland State University or Reed College. Portland was undoubtedly where we wanted to be. It was small but cool and had a hip art and music scene. We both liked the rain, that dismal gray sky thing that helped you write gritty songs or make great art. Plus, it was close enough to our families that we could see them when we wanted, but far enough away that they could never do a drop in. But I never told him about the conversation I had with my parents when I first signed up for the SAT test. In state, my dad said, we want you to go to the best school possible, but California has a slew of fantastic programs right here, and you won't put yourself into debt that way. No one wants college loans if you can help it. But I hadn't found a school in California that interested me half as much as Portland had. Seriously, Beckett. Seriously, Beckett said. What are you talking about, Cal? The whole college thing, I said. I'm just not sure I'm going to do it. Give me that bottle back, he said, reaching for it, just as Rabbit said, Here we go. Don't be ridiculous, Beck said. Of course you're going to college, in Portland, with me. I could tell by the rise in his voice and the slowness in mine that there was no way the conversation would bring about anything good. But I had to get it out before saying it out loud meant that I was serious. Because saying it out loud meant that I was serious. But it meant that the foreign language dictionaries in the back of my closet were more than just a weird habit or a wish. I'm not, Beck. I can't. I've been researching this international program with Habitat for Humanity instead, so I can travel. The website said that the host country covered a lot of the costs for volunteers, so I figured the program would be pretty cheap, cheaper than college at least. It would give me the chance to explore other countries and cultures in a way that going to college wouldn't. And skipping town, getting as far away as possible from the city that stole my dad, was the best idea I'd come up with in a long time. That's such a cop-out, Beckett said, and he leaned toward me, glaring. My parents can't afford to send me to Portland, I told him, and he said, Liar. But I shook my head. It's true. They said so themselves when I started researching schools. This isn't my fault. Maddie said, Come on, you guys. But we talked right over here. You're full of shit, he said louder, and you're acting like a drunk, I told him, as I leaned for the bottle, but he was too fast. You're not listening. There's nothing I can do. Give me a break, he said. Nothing you can do? Who are you? He shook his head, rolled his eyes. Lately, you've become this pushover, he said, like a zombie. I've never seen you act like this, so complacent. I'm actually embarrassed for you, Callie. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course I do, he said. You don't know what you're talking about. Of course I do, he said. The Callie I know, she'd make sure she went to Portland if she really wanted to. I tried to tell him again. Out-of-state tuition was too expensive for my parents, and the Habitat program would give me a chance to travel before I had to commit to college, but he wouldn't let me explain. We had a plan, Cal, he said. It's like ever since your dad, but I stopped him. Careful, Beckett. I said, I'm serious. Relax, you guys, Rabbit said, but I couldn't slow things down. I kept thinking of the 39 days that hadn't changed a thing, and the way Beckett had just sat there and done nothing too. He was my best friend. He should have called me out, should have snapped me awake, not watched while I went through the motions. What was he doing those 39 days? It's like you're giving up, just quitting, like not even you anymore, he said, even though it didn't make any sense to say it like that. Of course, I wasn't me anymore. How could I be? My dad, my favorite grown up, had upped and disappeared without a trace. It's like you just don't even care anymore, Beckett said before he swigged another shot of whiskey, his eyes red and watery. We put up some posters, Callie, that's it. Are you kidding me? We both had our hands wrapped around the bottle then, tugging it back and forth while I tried to imagine what he was saying, to ignore what he was saying. He was wrong. I hadn't quit looking for my dad. I just hadn't figured out how to start. You're a moron, you know that? I said, pulling harder on the bottle. Who are you to judge? Tears trailed down my cheeks, hot and unexpected. It didn't happen to you. You don't know what you're talking about. He jerked the bottle up toward him, and I had both hands on the neck and yanked it back, stubborn. And then, inevitably, the whiskey bottle slipped from his fingers and flew toward my face before either of us had time to stop it. After we cleaned up the campsite and put out the fire and watched Maddie and Rabbit head to their tent, we slunk to our sleeping bags, and Beckett rolled toward me, his chest against my back, as he draped his arms around me and pulled me close. I'm sorry about your face, he said. You were right. I haven't tried hard enough, I said. You know, it's been 39 days. How did that happen? I rubbed my nose on the small, scratchy camping pillow Becca had brought for me. I miss him, I said. I know you do. Like crazy miss him all the time. I tried to pretend it wasn't really happening at first, and now I'm worried it's been too long, that there's no way to fix it, I told him. His hand found my hand in the darkness and he squeezed. We can start again. Really start looking, he said, and I nodded. We'll make a game plan, make a detailed list of people to call and places we can look. I promise it'll be okay, Callie. Then he rolled away from me onto his back and whispered, I'm so sorry about the whiskey and about your face. I'm pretty sure I just gave my best friend a black eye. Worse things have happened, I told him. But he groaned. Bill Clinton. It wasn't my finest hour. It wasn't even my finest hour and a half, he said.